For our next segment, Foreign Journalists, the First Amendment as a Beacon of Liberty, we welcome moderator Robert Rosenthal, former editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer, former managing editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, and former executive director of the Center for Investigative Reporting, where he currently serves as a member of the board. Our panelists for this session include Amanda Bennett, Suki Kim, Elizaveta Osetinskaya. Would you please join me on stage? Amanda Bennett is director of Voice of America, the largest United States international radio broadcast source, providing news and information in more than 40 languages to a weekly audience of more than 200 million. Ms. Bennett is former editor of Bloomberg News and the Philadelphia Inquirer, reported for the Wall Street Journal for more than 20 years, and has been a contributing columnist for the Washington Post. Suki Kim wrote the New York Times bestseller, Without You, There Is No Us, Undercover Among the Sons of North Korea's Elite. Her first novel, The Interpreter, won the PEN Open Book Award and was a finalist for a PEN Hemingway Prize. And her essays and articles have appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, and the New York Review of Books. She is 2019 New America National Fellow. She is a contributing editor to the New Republic magazine, and her feature on What's Really Behind Trump and Kim Jong-un runs today. Elizaveta Osetinskaya is a fellow at the University of California, Berkeley School of Journalism. She founded and runs the Russian English language media startup, The Bell, and the YouTube video blog, Russians Are Okay.
So I want to start off by, again, thanking Duquesne University and the Pittsburgh Foundation for making these 2 days really remarkable conversations. With this panel, we've heard a lot of things at a very high level and very important levels in terms of the law, the internet, technology, how editors of major news organizations think. But we're going to bring it down to a level of what journalists actually face on the ground. And we started off the conference yesterday with a moment of silence for Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered 2 weeks ago because he was a journalist. But I also want to remind people that he wasn't the only journalist killed this year. So we're going to show a brief clip from the Committee to Protect Journalists about the 44 other journalists who've been killed this year in the world and in the United States because they were journalists. So one of the words we haven't heard in 2 days here is empathy. And I'm not trying to generate empathy for what journalists do because we all know what we're getting into. But the best reporting of journalists also leads to empathy and understanding for people all around the world. And for me, I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist. I actually was an editorial assistant on the Pentagon Papers when I was 22 years old and part of that team, which we've heard about. I've also been a prisoner in a dungeon in Uganda because I was a journalist. And I've sent people into combat in really difficult situations. But I take this personally, some of the things we're hearing in today's world. And I'm hoping today that each one of these terrific journalists and writers talk a little bit about, first about who they are and what they've done, and then we're going to have a conversation. So Amanda, why don't you start and tell us about the Voice of America, where you're currently working and leading.
Yes, thank you. And I'd just like to point out that in that, that little slideshow there, 3 of the journalists that were killed in Kabul were our colleagues from the Radio Free Europe, and they were killed all at the same time during the bombing there. And Voice of America earlier this year also lost a Somali cameraman in a bombing in Mogadishu this year. So these issues that Jamal Khashoggi raises are not theoretical ones for us. They're very real. And the outcome of how much governments push back on this kind of behavior really does have very practical implications for the news gathering force that we have. Before you can understand, I think, what I'm talking about, I'd like to just give you a brief overview of what the Voice of America is, because I find that even among my journalistic colleagues, there's a misunderstanding about who we are and what we do. And the first is that, yes, we still do exist. We're basically the US's BBC. We're structured very similarly. We have a very similar news force. We have an audience of 240 million. It's not just radio anymore. We have television, all forms of digital. We broadcast basically in any form that people in the country use widely. And if you want to know what countries we broadcast into, take the Freedom House's list of unfree countries, basically count 60 countries up from the bottom, and that's our audience. So we are broadcasting into countries that have either very little or no free press at all. We are 100% funded by the US government, which leads my former journalistic colleague friends to say, oh, geez, after such a long and distinguished journalism career, how do you feel about doing propaganda? And my answer is, I wouldn't know. Because even though we are 100% funded by the US government, this is extremely critical. It's extremely critical right now. We are legally protected by a set of laws and regulations from interference by the US government. Those are not trivial laws, and they are in fact widely honored throughout the press, throughout the Congress, and throughout the administration. I took my job under the Obama administration. I continued to serve a year and a half into the Trump administration. This is not unusual. We cross administrations. So these protections are really quite real. And by the way, when we were talking about Trust Guard, I very quickly looked up and made sure we have a 100% green rating from Trust Guard, unlike our RT colleagues who have a red rating. So we are recognized as neutral and objective by organizations that check those things. We've been led almost, not entirely, but almost by journalists. I was a colleague of David Shribman back in the day. Rosie and I were, and Max King were editors of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and some of our other reporters were our other directors were leaders of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other news organizations. So it's been led by journalists. And so you need to understand also that we are fed, not entirely, but almost entirely by citizens, and in many cases, most cases, residents of the countries we cover. Their jobs are dangerous. They do it because of a passion for free press. And I'd like to reiterate again that what happens with Jamal Khashoggi is not trivial for us. It really makes a difference for the safety and well-being of people who are reporting into their own countries. And could I just have one slide up? I'd like to show you something I think and I hope will startle you. If you look at those numbers up on the corner there, I don't know if you can see them, it's kind of an eye test. But look at the size of the markets that we have. That's our market share on the right, is the percentage of the adults that we reach every week. And on the left is the trust. Those are trust numbers I don't think you'll see anywhere else that you look. And the reason they trust us is they are living in environments, not where they're worried as we are now about the infiltration of falsehood. They're living in environments where they know they are receiving falsehoods, that no media around them can be trusted, and they turn to us for that information. So even though protection of our journalists is important, what is most important, most critical, this is really, really important, that the laws that separate us from the government, which we colloquially call the firewall, continue to be respected and protected. That is the single most important existential issue that faces us, because if those walls and protections are breached, what goes away is not just free press in those countries, but the belief that a free press can exist. So I just want to say, please pay attention to the principles that people have been talking about here, because those principles are important.
Suki, you made a decision to basically go undercover into North Korea to tell a story. And can you tell us about why you did that? And also, obviously, you knew there was tremendous risk if you had been discovered, and how you dealt with that.
Well, it's, here we are at the First Amendment conference. North Korea is a place where there is no freedom of any kind, freedom of speech to begin with. So what that means is that not only is it, there is no freedom of speech inside the country, but it also forbids any sort of writing about North Korea. So if you try to cover it, and I've been covering North Korea for about 16 years, and you can't really get to the heart of the place, and that's the frustration with a topic like this, because all the things that we are now these days talk about in America, like fake news, death of the media, all of that is basically what North Korea has done very successfully. So if you're trying to cover it, all you're getting is a propaganda. So I started entering North Korea from 2002. I'm also fluent in Korean. I grew up in South Korea. So I had the background to try to understand the country in more depth. And very quickly, it was obvious that just going in there for a few days on different kind of reasons will not give me anything that's even remotely close to what's really going on inside the country. And if you deliver that government-sanctioned version of it, then you've just now served as a propaganda PR person for North Korean regime. So what are the alternatives? I knew that I had to be immersed in there somehow, so I tried all different methods of trying to get in to live there, not just for a few days. It took me basically 10 years and 5 years of going into 5 different visits of going into North Korea to find a way in, which is when I went in 2011, posing as an evangelical school teacher, ended up in this military compound living with 20-year-old young men, male only, 270 of them, North Koreans, in a locked compound for 6 months during the year that Kim Jong-il died and Kim Jong-un rose to power. So that was, in the most recent history, the most important year of North Korea's history. So what we always also want to know about North Korea is, sure, there's a gulag and there's a nuclear weapons and all these things, but any coverage of North Korea generally lacks nuance because you can't get to the place and you can't interview people on the street because those are chosen for you. So then living there, being immersed in it, trying to catch subtleties, and not through the traditional journalistic method of interviewing, but being just living in it, you start grasping what's under the surface. And I do believe, actually, not all topics are the same. I think the topics are very different. And in a case like North Korea, that's master at manipulating the media and also just lies after lies after lies, then it just takes a different kind of work. So that was an undercover work. And that was the only way I could have covered the topic, and also why it was so devastatingly important. I will never forget the first time I went there in 2002. I ended up writing a feature essay for the New York Review of Books, but I remember in those 8 days' time, I wept just nonstop because I knew the violations that had happened here in a place that had nothing, that had also completely managed to isolate itself to this degree for 70 years. That means people have been killed for generations. And that truth had never come out, and there is no journalistic evidence. So then how am I going to pursue this to get to the core of the place? And I think that ended up being really, I had no idea it's going to be such a long journey, but it was just a relentless pursuit of the truth of the place.
So Elizaveta just flew in from Moscow this last night, about a 30-hour trip. So I hope she stays awake. And she's flying back tonight.
I'm trying.
But her story is fascinating because she was actually had to leave Moscow a few years ago because of work she had done as a journalist, and yet she's now had the courage and the ability to go back. So can you tell us about not only why you had to leave, but how you faced going back, knowing what you know?
Yeah, just in brief, I have to explain who I am and how I landed here in the United States, not yesterday, but generally speaking. So I started in the mid of 90s as oil and energy reporter for the press. And then for my luck, I joined the newspaper Vedomosti, that was a subsidiary of Wall Street Journal and Financial Times by that time. And I built my career in this newspaper and became editor of this newspaper. And then I coherently ran Vedomosti, Forbes Russia, and a media called RBC that had TV channel, the largest business news portal in the country, newspaper, and the magazine. So I was editorial director of this outlet. And when I came there, we started changing editorial policy and made a lot of investigative reporting. That was year 2014. That was a turning point in Russia and for Russia in international relationships, especially with the United States. And of course, we blew against the wind. And the most culminating story we published and the most exciting story we worked on was a story about Putin's dancing daughter. For surprise of the most people in US, the Russian president doesn't disclose any information about his family, especially about his children. So this is one of the top state secrets. And of course, that was definitely crossing the lines publication and revealing the business side of his youngest daughter and telling her story we published only about business and we didn't touch her private life. So she was involved in kind of creating Russian type Silicon Valley near Moscow State University in Moscow. And of course, that was a big deal. But to your surprise, I was not kicked from this organization after the publication. And the year after that, we published another story related to Putin's family about his son-in-law and his business. And well, of course, the bright publications in Russia are followed by bright departure of certain journalists. So like in about a few months after second publication, we also published Panama Papers. And then the government put tough pressure on the owner of the publication, and he had to change the editorial team. And afterwards, I landed at Stanford first. I became a fellow at JSK Knight Fellowship, where I came to the idea that Russian people, global-minded, westernized Russian people, need a thought partner, because despite of all confrontation with the West, these people are still alive, and they need certain media to deliver their goals and values. From another side, West also, as I thought that time, needs certain medium to communicate and to get fair and detailed information about the country. And that's how I came to the idea of the Bell. Then I moved to Berkeley, so there is no mistake in bio. So I moved from Stanford to Berkeley, where I started with support of some people and Lowell Bergman from Investigative Reporting program. I started working on this idea of the Bell. And to now we have a website with approximately 1 million uniques per month, 30,000 subscribers newsletter. I have my personal video blog where I interview Russian-speaking entrepreneurs who achieved global success, like Phil Libin or some.
But are those
David
people
Young.
in Russia, or they've had to leave?
Well, the thing is that nobody had to leave. Only some people had to leave. Well, people had their own destinies. I mean, some people left because their parents left. Some people decided to move to Silicon Valley because it's better fit their businesses, and so on. So we also have English language newsletter, weekly newsletter that I encourage you to subscribe on our website. So yes, and I'm doing quite, so we have team of 10 people on the ground in Moscow.
So let me interrupt. But so you had to leave because of a story you wrote, and obviously Russian journalists have been murdered or killed because of their work, but you're confident in going back where you're still able to work there? And how do you face that threat when you know you're doing stories some people might not like?
First, the devil is always in the details. So the general impression of Russia on the West is that Russia is very well-run, managed state with a very, I would say, monolith idea and monolith thoughts of people, and that's actually completely not true. Russia is, I would say, poorly managed state with a lot of people having in power, having their own interests, own ideas, and sometimes values. And the only thing that unifies them now is confrontation with the West. That's true. But also, they have, in the government and the Kremlin, they have liberal wings, more conservative, heavily conservative wings, and that's surprising thing, but that I'm not only able to travel freely into the country, but I also can do, for example, public talks with people, former government people or people in the government, but being in complete confrontation with some other people whose goal is just to turn our media off or put us on the list of foreign agents together with Voice of America, and so on and so forth. So Russian society is not homogeneous, and a power is very complicated agent that is better to study.
Okay. Amanda, with the journalists who work for you, I mean, there's no First Amendment protection, you know, and the Solicitor General in the earlier panel mentioned the fact that one of the things that when our founding fathers wrote the First Amendment, people could be hung and executed. Well, in the countries your journalists are working in, they are arrested and beaten and sometimes executed. How do you worry, or do you worry about protecting them, and can you?
I worry about it all the time, and we can't protect them. And this is one of the things I find so touching, so moving, is the people that come to work for us, do this work, face down these dangers, because they see the value of free, neutral, independent information. I say that the Voice of America is exporting the First Amendment, because every story that we do, every time we do something, we show that it can be done. And these journalists are very, very brave. And you know, the things that they face are not only being arrested, detained, roughed up. I mean, I have a list here of the things that have just happened so far this year. But the cross-national threats that they're facing now raises the danger quite significantly. I'll just give you one example. This is our Radio Free Asia colleagues. There's family members of 6 of the journalists who are located in Washington have been rounded up and sent to those Uyghur re-education camps. The family members back in China have been arrested and taken into basically concentration camps because of the work of the journalists here. So the threats that these people are facing are really immense.
So Governor Ridge, in another earlier panel, said that the undermining trust is the ultimate threat to a democracy, and he was referencing the press and also obliquely talking about the enemy of the people comments of President Trump, or even last week that it was okay to body slam a journalist. How do you, being funded by the U.S. government, deal with that when your own journalists are around the world? Do you message that internally? How do you deal with that?
You know, it's really one of the, again, touching and inspiring things, because we are broadcasting. These things that we are experiencing are coming to us against a context of our entire lifetimes understanding the freedoms that we have and benefiting from the freedoms that we have. When I go and go out and see in the other countries, these are countries that have either had these kinds of freedoms only briefly or very limited basis, or have never had these freedoms. And so for them, the reason there's those trust factors out there is they actually understand what it means to have impartial information given to them, and they see it coming from us. So for when we go out there, what they're saying is, please don't leave us. Please don't stop. Don't let this go away, which is why I say that the most important thing that we have is that separation from government that permits us to report freely, openly on our own government as well as any other governments. That concept, that foundation of independence is what we have to offer the rest of the world.
Thank you. Suki, in your book, can you describe for the audience what the news is like in North Korea that people are exposed to? What is the news about?
Well, I mean, I think being at this conference, it's been really fascinating to hear these words that come up, like democracy or truth, or because North Korea is a case where that's all been eradicated. So, you know, when I think in the first panel today, I think it was the executive editor of New York Times talking about that there are more options for the media. There's more than 2 papers. I mean, North Korea, there's only really 1 paper. They say more than 1 exists, but really only 1 working paper, and that is 6 pages long, and every article is about the great leader. Television is exactly the same, really only 1 functioning television channel, and that only shows programs about the great leader. What that also means, it brings back to, again, what we've been discussing, is the educated audience. Is it possible to have an audience who've been educated on nothing but the great leader? You can't really pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist and educate them on anything, history, literature, science, none of it is possible. So then you have an audience who literally has not had any information. It's not an informed audience you have in North Korea. Also, the concept of truth and lies, because the North Korean regime has successfully really told their people for generations that everything outside is a lie. So here, when we talk about fake news and taking away the credibility from the media, what North Korean government has done is to erase the media within their country, only have the concept of the great leader, and then took the credibility of the outside media away. So everything they're saying is not true. And here, we only have information about the great leader. So I think the fear of what we're talking about, you know, somehow losing this First Amendment, North Korea is what happens. You know, like it is possible to erase history. It is possible, and Korea is a 5,000-year-old history. In 70 years, history of North Korea, it has successfully erased 5,000 years. And the concept of truth and lies, and the ability in its citizens to differentiate between the 2. And I think what's really been alarming to me, in this country, it is true America has so much, but at the same time, I have to say in the current time, a lot of things remind me of North Korea a lot. This Twitter, president's Twitter that's happening constantly, those really remind me of those slogans in North Korea. Every building has a slogan by the great leader. Every wall has a slogan by the great leader. It would be something that he's saying in a very short sentence, just like what Twitter is, 140 characters, 280 characters. It's exactly like that, all about the greatness of the great leader, and it's not that different. And I think that, I mean, it's fascinating because more and more there is sadly some resemblance.
Yeah, one of the things, I'd go one little layer deeper, your interaction even with the students and the sort of the culture of lying that begins from the top and then in people's interactions with each other, the almost inability to deal with truth.
When actually, I mean, what's the most heartbreaking in an immersive journalism where I was really immersed and embedded within this group of future leadership of North Korea. They were 20-year-old young men who's going to lead this nation. I mean, the inability to tell the truth from lies comes from lying is a way of survival. You have to lie to survive, but sometimes they also got in a habit of constantly saying lies. And also, that's all they've ever known since birth. And sometimes they just couldn't tell the difference. And that, I think that's basically erasing humanity. If you cannot tell the difference what is true and what is not true, then it shakes your foundation. And I think that's what we've been talking about here a lot, listening to the panels, taking the credibility away from actually objective truth. I mean, that's all, we're talking about similar stuff, where your ground shakes, and then what is behind, what is left behind? I mean, it's basically, it's possible. You know, we think that it's not possible to lose everything, but North Korea is an example where all of that got lost, which is humanity and history and memory and truth, and I don't know what's more scary than a place like that.
Elizaveta, are there red lines or lines you can't cross as a journalist? And you know, the perception from here is that, I know we've talked a little bit that everything emanates down from Putin, and what you're saying, it's a much broader control system. But as a journalist there, and I don't know if you've known some of your colleagues who have been killed or are aware of that certainly, but as a fraternity, sorority of journalists, do you sort of watch each other? Are there red lines you say you can't cross, or the stories you won't go near? How do you manage that risk?
First of all, I have to say that fortunately Russia is not like North Korea yet. So, yet. We don't know how high is the speed of changes, but still Russia has free YouTube that is equally used by both opposition, free press, and Kremlin as well. So Kremlin became extremely efficient. I mean, I refer to your point about what's true and what is not true. So Kremlin uses the various channels in the country in a very efficient way to deliver its own agenda. And basically, the truth about Russian media landscape is that you can find any information you'd like and believe in everything you want to believe. So talking about lines, just today, Novaya, the very important institutionalized newspaper called Novaya Gazeta, reported amazing piece about Evgeny Prigozhin and affiliated parties that I hope will be translated.
What does that mean? Tell us more detail with that.
Well, Evgeny Prigozhin is a guy who is indicted in the United States for trolls factories. So he's Putin's chef, and he's the father of trolls factories that interfered U.S. elections. So the story is about some cases of violence that his people affiliated with him were involved. It's a very, very long piece. Unfortunately, I only was able to read it like this very quickly, but it gives like a perspective of what kind of people we deal on that side, for example. So this is definitely a red line reporting about Putin's family. That's certainly for established media that bell is not. But what I call what Russia calls in Russia is called established media is media who belonged to local people, local business, or to themselves, or who should operate within the country with cautiousness. So that's kind of a silent rule not to report aggressively about the Putin's family. But I have to say that there are a lot of other things that journalists report. For example, we all know the case of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who every day reveals new and different facts about Putin's inner circle, like Mr. Zolotov, who is chief of National Guard, or like some other officials who stole some money or purchased some property.
I think what you're saying is
yeah.
it's a much more open press than we think about
That
here.
yeah, it's also vastly used by Kremlin himself, but not always it gives certain results. For example, you say that Kremlin, some media, I would say like that Kremlin almost orchestrated elections in the United States, while Kremlin completely failed its own domestic elections on the Far East. When a governor from ruling party totally failed and totally lost elections to another, not opposition, but like regulated opposition candidate. But those things are possible, and it's another proof that Russian politics is not homogeneous and it's not well orchestrated and well managed from the top to the bottom. It's very different.
Amanda, before we only have a few minutes. How many languages is VOA broadcast in, and how many?
We have, in the building in Washington, D.C., we have 45 different newsrooms in 45 different languages, each one broadcasting according to its own market, and they make, they follow their own editorial judgment.
And what do you have? What kind of feedback loop do you have from actually the people of these countries? You know, we talked a lot about. It's not just the issues that we're talking about in terms of the press, but also the way people use information, and it's an audience problem, I'd say, in this country as well. But what do you see overseas?
You know, some of the new electronic media give you really very interesting insights into that, because we will run Facebook Live alongside our television programs or directly on Facebook Live, and you can watch people responding in real time. And some of our programs will have hundreds of thousands of likes or dislikes or comments. People actually sit down and they have dialogues on our site about the stories. Just popping into my head, we've run a series called The Worth of a Girl, which is about child marriage. I think we've got over 1 million comments on that now. So from all over the world.
So does China block VOA?
So it's what's interesting.
Or Russia?
So what's interesting is how much of an audience we have in countries that are blocked. We are totally blocked in Russia. We're totally blocked in China. We're totally blocked in North Korea. We're totally blocked in Iran. In Iran, where we are totally blocked, we have a 17% television market share, and we have a large and growing digital audience, which engages with us quite amazingly. During the street protests at Christmas, they were uploading their videos and their photos to us, and we were sending them back down again. It's really quite amazing. And even in North Korea, we have a small but very critical audience, which we know because we do defector surveys, and they tell us that they're very much aware of Voice of America and have access to it.
Okay, Suki, the title of your book is Without You, There Is No Us. Can you explain that and sort of the context of groupthink, messaging, and the big lie?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's a title of a song that's very popular in North Korea. So without the great leader, there is no us. And that concept of a country that is just run because of this one symbolic figure is really as unfathomable as it seems, is what's been happening there for 70 years. And I think, you know, when we talk about journalism, what it can do, if that kind of world can exist, there's no internet in that nation, not a free one anyway. You know, that's been going on for so long, and we're just dark about North Korea on that level, in a more complicated level. And I think that's a job of journalism, to open door to that, so that this kind of horrificness doesn't continue and continue. How long would it continue that way? Because if we don't, it just will.
Mm-hmm. Elizaveta, we have like about a minute, but what, from a Russian audience perspective, would they understand the First Amendment, or they just think it's a lot of baloney?